Alright, welcome back everybody to the Rock Roundtable. This episode's mostly going to be me and Ben talking, although Matthew is present. Right now the main album review on my channel is The Who's My Generation, so I would strongly recommend going and watching that. I will have a link to the Who album reviews playlist down below. And on Friday I'm going to be releasing a review of Electric Light Orchestra's A New World Record. So before we begin on this in-depth conversation on The Who's albums, I would like to urge everyone to like this video and subscribe to my channel if they aren't already, because we already have several episodes like this. We have already done ones on Led Zeppelin and the Beatles, so go watch those if you want as well. And without further ado, here we're going to get started. The people, or me, Ben, and of course our good friend Matthew, although as I said he sits out this roundtable a lot here, so it's mostly going to be me and Ben debating. I guess the next thing to discuss is The Who, and then we'll discuss David Bowie after that. I don't know if you're as much of a Who listener as me and Ben or Matthew.
I've only listened to their most famous Who album.
Which one, Tommy?
No, Bubba O'Reilly. The one for
Who's Next?
Who's Next?
Who's Next? Yeah. Who's Next is a great album. I guess this will be a little bit shorter of a segment than the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, since it'll mostly just, I guess, be me and Ben talking here. So, Ben, what are your thoughts on the Who's best album one? What would you consider to be the main album one?
I'm inclined to take the main album one, as opposed to, like, the best three albums, all as My Generation, A Quick One, The Who Sell Out Tommy, Who's Next, and Quadrophenia. Like, there's good songs on Who by the Numbers, there's good songs on, Who Are You, and there's good songs on Basis Dances, and this whole those ones a week over the previous two. I mean, we could also include Live at Leeds, and what I just said, I think that would also be reasonable.
Leeds, a lot of people tend to include Live at Leeds as part of their main discography.
Yeah, I mean, I would be fine with saying My Generation, A Quick Line of The Who Sell Out Tommy, Live at Leeds, Who's Next, and Quadrophenia is the main one.
I'd say, My Generation through Quadrophenia is probably the best sort of solution. I mean, as you know, I've already, of course, covered on my channel A Quick One. I've already reviewed that a long time ago, actually. And I will be reviewing My Generation on May 5th. And so that video will come out here at some point in the future from when we're recording this, but when this part of the video actually comes out, I don't know. It may be already out. But yeah, and I'll do the other ones as well. I think Live at Leeds should probably be included in that. It's got some great stuff on it. It's generally considered, a part of their, I think, main discography by a lot of their fans. It's got Summertime Blues, that's a good song. It's got the only album version of Magic Bus, because otherwise that was a single. I suppose we're not really counting stuff like the compilation albums and stuff from the 70s, although there was a pretty good amount of stuff that's like the singles and stuff on there as well. And I'm assuming we're not counting that other version of Tommy that was not the movie soundtrack version, but the other one that was like the play.
Even including Live at Leeds, in some ways is somewhat disruptive. But, like, I'm gonna count it, at least for this, like, best one, the wheel skipping compilation albums that were coming out at that time.
Live at Leeds was The Who's album, as far as I'm concerned, for 1970. They literally played the concert saying, we're gonna play this concert and we're gonna, I think, pick out, like, the best stuff and put out as an LP. They literally, it wasn't a part of a concert tour. It was literally just, like, one event, basically, that was meant to be kind of for, well, they were doing something in between, Tommy and Lifehouse / Who's Next. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, I would say that Leeds I would personally count, and that would make that one from 1965 to 1973, that would be 8 years. I mean, that would be one of the longer ones we're looking at. And that would be, like, what, 7 albums?
Yeah, I mean, my generation, I guess, is like the weakest, or like,
My
if a wine
generation's
is gonna.
about on par with a quick one. A quick one sees more of a development in rock, you know. My generation is more of the kind of shorter, more sort of concise, kind of more just kind of classics of rock songs. Whereas on a quick one, you know, it's mostly that, but you do see less on a quick one, which is starting to kind of be a bit more proggy, long-winded, a bit more concepty, that leads towards Royale from the Who Sell Out, which then leads, of course, into Tommy and Quadrophenia's existence, as well as that of Lifehouse and stuff like that, that kind of exist in concept, but don't really exactly exist.
Well, in some ways, I think the argument for including my generation, but not including the first four Beatles albums, and their one is that my generation is more connected in some ways, even if it is more. In some ways, sounds quite a bit different than like what you hear on a lot of Tommy or whatnot. In some ways, it is more.
I mean,
It's less, or maybe I should say it's less. It's less primitive. Even if it has a very raw, almost
it's less
punk
primitive
sound.
compared to their main style. You know, in that point in time, you know, even on my generation, Entwistle, Moon, they're in top form, you know. Keith Moon already has his whole, you know, style down. It never really changes.
It's not. I mean, all performance art has an audience. Obviously, the audience was like mods and stuff, but like in some ways, it's less pandering than some of the early Beatles albums. It's not only just like does it sound more raw, but like it is less pandering. They're not constructing themselves as idols in some ways, and it's not like if it was opening Beatles albums, the Beatles were like, "I'm John." My songs are all John themed about my character personality or whatever. But like in some ways, in the Beatles, they all, well, even with a doing good songs or covering good songs or whatever, they're solving a different purpose that is. I mean, everyone's playing a role in performance art, but when the Beatles are doing their game, it's a different game than the Who's, in the sense that the Who's this performance and their attitude, which is not to say some of the Beatles songs or not have sincere or elements to them. In fact, they do. But the way they're approaching it is to, I would say, is more. I mean, to some extent, I'm struggling not to try to fall into like raucous or like punk raucous attitudes here or vocabulary, because I do think very polished records. There will be very polished records, like All Things That Must Pass, and stuff that are not very similar to punk rock, or not raw or angry or whatever, that are very authentic, that are very sincere, very significant artistic achievements. Nevertheless, when we're talking about this primitive versions of these bands, I think the sincere discomfort that is expressed in my generation, kind of the portrayal of alienation and depression in The Kids Are All Right, but also kind of a weird, almost, you know, universal owing while also depressed, which is, it's a unique song. The Kids Are All Right is a unique song, and I'm surprised we have a whole back to talk about it more, honestly, because it is kind of, feels like kind of a, now he is obviously primarily concerned with his goal. This is primarily concerned, but he also has kind of a universal. He's not jealous. He's not a jealous person.
I know if I go, things would be a lot better for her.
Mm-hmm. But there's also depressed. That's a depressed side. It's not a.
Yeah, it's not that kind of in the same place, similar to like I'm a loser or something, but of a more sort of, but giving the narrator a bit more of a choice, more of a dilemma. He's a bit, I guess, less passive in his own story. He is actually going to have to do something.
Yeah, I mean, he's not... John Lennon... It's the self-loathing without anger in some ways. It's like a Cecile Pulse's depression. It's somebody who's genuinely the people he's interacting with he likes and cares about and is not suspicious of. It's not
except for on How Do You Sleep, but that's...
It's not... Yeah, it's not a paranoid person. It's not a... In some ways, there was a sense of caring in a very detached sense, but also in a very personal sense about the goal in it. But then at the same time, there's a detachment there. It kind of reminds me of a debate in ancient Chinese philosophy between the Confucians, not Confucius himself, who was already debated this place, but people like Mencius in Latin, and Master Mozi. Master Mo argued almost a primitive version, well, maybe not primitive, it's not primitive at all, like, only similar to utilitarianism, idea of emphasizing what heaven or God, which are kind of the same concept in Chinese language, wants is universal killing, the way... Not select the Mandalorian. The way is universal killing. And that you should not prioritize any one person over any other person. But utilitarianism does not assault, actually. But somebody's kind of does on the raw level, but then you have to try to think about how much each person's calculating utility. Wow. Moism's consequentialist calculus assumes that you should treat all people as equals,
yes,
morally, and equals in terms of how much you should care about them. The question is not, like, calculating the caring, but, like, calculating actions, but not calculating the caring about them. But there's kind of still virtue ethics to it that is not present in, say, actual utilitarianism. Well, Mencius argued that one should care more about the people closest to them, and then it will spread out using metaphors of Confucius, that caring, if you care about the people and the relationships that are described by Confucius, that caring will eventually become spread out. You still care more about the people around you and focus your attention more on people around you, but the caring will extend over time like ripples of water.
Yes, well, the way I see it, you know, I know Pete Townsend would at times get into some of this, like, weird dogma stuff, but, I very much doubt that, they were thinking about Confucius, it was thinking about Confucius when he wrote The Kids All White.
Oh, no, I don't think he was either, but in some ways...
Like, the way I see it, this album one we're talking about is... You know, as you said, there is a very raw energy on, you know, the first album. It's a very kind of statement about, I guess, rebelling, about, you know, teen rebellion, honestly, in the 60s. And, you know, honestly, where I see it, this is perfectly bookmarked, this album when we're talking about From My Generation to Quadrophenia, because Quadrophenia is literally a concept album based around that whole theme with, you know, Jimmy and, you know, being a mod and having the scooter and the jeans and the whatever.
Yeah.
And, you know, My Generation is said, obviously kind of echoed throughout that album. The Kids All White plays in that album too. And so they act as kind of a bookend. Those songs are sort of the bookend to the whole kind of the original, I guess, Who run. You got, you know, basically the song that is what the Who were doing when this whole movement was going on. And then you've got the Who kind of been sending off and kind of telling the story of the movement at the very end and sort of, I guess, commemorating it in a way with Quadrophenia, kind of giving it an epic walking send-off.
Yes. I mean, yeah, back to My Generation and The Kids All White. I was not trying to argue that Townsend was thinking about this stuff. He clearly probably wasn't. But I do think, in some ways, both of those ideas are portrayed in the song in a form, but they're both being portrayed as negative, I guess. Well, not negative, not immoral, but as a kind of both this detached from the self form, this altruism, I guess, of sorts, in the philosophical sense of doing a calculus about the other people around you and not about yourself at all. Even though there's kind of these two contradictory things in there, the kind of the I kill kind of about, all these people are fine, and then the more specified killing of, about the goal of what's better for all, that seem to exist simultaneously. Which, I mean, I guess in Mingzi,
it's
one
weird.
is emanating from the other.
Ben,
Which just seems to be what happened in here.
Weird.
It's a symptom of depression.
Ben.
It's that he's not caring about himself because of that.
Ben.
Uh-huh.
You're right, it is kind of odd. The Beatles obviously put out this kind of less threatening presence, sort of the less threatening image than what The Who had. The Who deliberately tried to play up, But, if you look at some of the songs, you especially compare something like The Kids All Right, that My Generation came out December 1965, and then you compare it to a different song on a different album that came out in December of 1965, Rebel Soul, you compare it to One Feel Live, really the difference is night and day, but one of them, despite having a horrible kind of sound in some ways, Kids All White is still one of the softer Who songs, but it does certainly have a lot of drumming and stuff than what Ringo Starr was doing. Ultimately has kind of a softer, more kind of squishy message behind it that's a bit more of a kind of one of kindness. And so you've got kind of something interesting like that. You've got kind of a machismo there, but you've also got kind of, and you see this, I guess, kind of music, you kind of see this in Behind Blue Eyes too, kind of a machismo that's a little over the top in a lot of places. At the same time, it is mixed more honestly with this sort of vulnerability that's sort of a caring,
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a counterpoint. My generation is, I mean, on the one hand, it's being universalized to his generation, but it is, in some ways, I don't want to call it a selfish song, because I think it's a sincere song, and a correct analysis, in some ways, of the stifling in response, but it's an individualistic song, maybe I should say, even if the language in it is collective. It is, we want to do what we want, in some ways, not in a, like, absolute objectivist or like insane way, but like, or selfish way, but like, we're having people try to put us down. They're trying to go after us just because we do things that they don't like that are not immoral. And it's an angry song about individuals being put down, basically put in their place, or attempting to, but they resist. It's like a punk song, in some ways, proto-punk. While in The Kids Are Alright is like the opposite. He's depressed and detached from himself. He is achieving, in some ways, some of these philosophical ideals, even though he's not discussing them, of a very collectivist culture that is what was in China, and also, what I guess a Comtean ideal, which I was hoping we would hear from Matthew about, because I've heard him discuss this. But he's achieving, in some ways, morally good work. Like, he's, I think, morally doing good, but he's also doing quite poorly. Like, he's clearly depressed, really depressed, to the point that he doesn't see his own value to people he loves. And that's bad. And it's an interesting paradox in some ways. It makes the album much more substantive than, like, Please Please Me, or With the Beatles, or Hard Day's Night, or most of the songs on Beatles for Sale. It's It's not. I mean, yes, there's this countercultural machismo posturing in some of these songs. There's like an openness about sex in some of these songs that is a
Most of them, the Beatles at first.
It's like it's the '50s counterculture. It's which it bled and continued on into modern culture and stuff in a way that it didn't happen as much in the United States, but it kind of did. And arguably, in some extent, it got absorbed into the main culture. Quite a bit, but then re-explored it as elements of the counterculture in the '60s, combined with a novel '50s counterculture, beatnik culture that we do not need to discuss right now. And you have this kind of Elvis, James Dean counterculture of the '50s portrayed in this album, but it existed in that version. A lot of characters, not Elvis, but in like James Dean films or like films from that counterculture period, do portray very alienated people. They're alienated and maybe not selfish. In some ways, they're right. They're the my generation character. But it's also portraying a character like you encountered to some extent in those Beatles songs we discussed. That is, but is actually achieving more ideals. While John Lennon makes very clear that he is not a saint in some of these songs, the character in The Kids All Right in some ways is a saint.
They never really pretended to be saints, though, will they?
No, they don't pretend to be saints at all in that album. But the character is almost saintly in his behavior, and he's still screwed up and depressed. So, like, he's very alienated from himself, and thus from the people he cares about, even if he is engaging in deep caring about them, which is morally correct. It's a very interesting album in that way, and much deeper, I would say, than the older Beatles albums.
It's also somewhat more instrumentally interesting, especially like the guitar thing on Illegal Matter in particular, I think, is a lot more advanced instrumentally than really anything the Beatles were doing. I mean, it very much foretold, I think, kind of Jimi Hendrix in some way. You know, I mean, let's face it, Cream hadn't even started yet when My Generation came out. Now Clapton had already been in the Yardbirds and stuff, but, you know, it was very much kind of an early instance of that sort of level of guitar heroic. So yeah, I mean, obviously they have songs that are about relationships and whatever that's like that. Then they have the kind of story albums. Obviously we have Tommy and Quadrophenia. But there is also some sort of level of thing that's all kind of the same in kind of the countercultural sort of vibe about it. I mean, Tommy and Tommy is an underdog. Essentially, he is brought into this world by parents who are rather screwed up individuals, and he has to live with these abusive people like Uncle Orny, Cousin Kevin, etc., while at the same time being a disabled person. Obviously, those people were also not treated well by society, and people had expectations of him that he couldn't possibly hope to meet. And ultimately, he ends up kind of becoming a star by doing his own thing. And so it's kind of an underdog story at first, but then, of course, he does, you know, obviously at the end, he lets it get to his head, honestly. He kind of forgets where he came from of being the little guy and tries to become, you know, kind of bossy, rude, overly strict, and then the people under him, sort of, who become the little guy themselves, compared to him, sort of overthrow him in a way in his own cult. And Quadrophenia is kind of a bit more of a grounded story that's about, you know, I guess self-expression in the 1960s, early 1960s, by the youth. It's not as, I guess, dramatic of a sort of a statement as Tommy is. It's a bit more grounded in reality. There's nothing that's exactly unrealistic that happens in it, but it very much has kind of the same theme. There's this guy, he is mentally unwell, but he never really... I guess he's able to, in the end, sort of, I guess, find some degree of just, I guess, continuing on and not sorting a cult exactly like Tommy did. But he's very much, we're both very much people who are sorts of the underdogs of society. I mean, we know in Quadrophenia it sounds like Jimmy is quite poor, and we don't, I guess we know about the financial situation of Tommy. We know they're both kind of mentally ill to some degree. We know that, his parents don't like the sort of music Jimmy's listening to, whereas Tommy's parents are obviously a mess, and they let bad people do bad things to him. And just, I think there's also an implication that, I guess, at least to some degree, that Jimmy's father was abusive in Quadrophenia as well, although that's not really fully fleshed out upon. And obviously he has a drug addiction problem, and as well as seemingly an alcoholism problem as well. So they're both sort of the kind of the underdogs, sort of the undesirables of society, kind of mentally ill. Jimmy's poor, Tommy's an invalid, basically. And Tommy's a kid, and Jimmy is quite young still, although he's older than I think Tommy's supposed to be. And the older sorts of adults really just don't take kindly for them just trying to, I guess, kind of live their lives in some ways. But I guess in Tommy's case, it kind of gets turned on its head, where he goes from being the guy who's being kind of pushed around by the people in charge to some degree, or society's expectations, to him putting all these expectations to his and other people, and then them becoming sort of the underdogs to his kind of, overlord, and then them kind of overthrowing him at the end as kind of a uprising of themselves. And obviously we see these themes of underdogs and uprisings, and it being kind of a cycle, but maybe not really accomplishing as much as it should in songs like Won't Get Fooled Again as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah, so yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
In some ways, there was quite a bit of... the Beatles' perspective is sometimes revolutionary. Okay, so there's been kind of two sorts of takes on the... I know we're going back to the Beatles, but I promise I'll get to the Who. So the Beatles' takes... There's kind of two sorts of takes. The Beatles' musical aesthetic applied to the middle class. Now, I don't think that John Lennon and stuff were really middle class when they were children. Especially not John.
Ringo in particular, I think, was quite poor.
Yeah,
in particular, partly because of his health problems, but also partly because I don't think they were very well off at all as a child. But obviously, Ringo's not really the main songwriter of the Beatles. But I will say, it is my understanding that Ringo was not well off as a child, in particular.
Yeah. I think Lennon and Ringo and stuff, they're not... They weren't living the middle class ideal or anything even close to it. They were not... middle class. I guess a value set was not bourgeoisie or petite bourgeoisie or whatnot. But by that point in history, I guess the middle class is more, in some ways, better salaried paid workers, especially as you get into the 50s or whatever. But they've absorbed cultural values and stuff, kind of related to that over time or synthesized. Nevertheless, the Beatles have in their early albums handling, even though their music, there were still people that were offended by it. They were like, oh, this is edgy rock stuff, and blah, 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 blah. In some ways, their music is quite, thematically sanitized, in a way to appeal to middle-class girls. And boys, to a lesser extent, but to middle-class girls. Now, they're very good at what they do, so it's fine for me listening to it. I'll be like, yeah, this is good. But, that is what's going on there. Thus, even though Lennon himself has kind of a... But at the same time, I don't think that's a continuous thing. But then they become rich people, and there's kind of a rich person's impulse to, not like high taxes or whatever, but also appeal. But that also kind of originates from the middle class ideology, which is not like a specific political ideology here. A middle class ideology in which the Beatles' songs are situated, although audience they were appealing to was that, but that's not going to be just a one-way street of them, I don't know, saying things to the middle class and the middle class eating it up. It's also going to walk in the opposite direction, you know? And there's like some level of that in the Beatles, but there's also, because there is clearly also a revolutionary working class edge in the Beatles. I mean, you see it even in George Harrison's Peggy's, you see it in John Lennon's solo quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
And that comes from his situation as a child, and as well as from elements of the zeitgeist, to be sure, and stuff. But the Who are coming from a much more working class perspective. It's a working class. And working class at Britain, it's not like starving people, it's not like starving peasants. It's still working class, though. Like, these people have TVs, they have radios, they're not like super poor. They're, I guess, the poor of a global rich. But, like, at the same time, they all factory workers, children, and, you know, they're kind of moving from paycheck to paycheck. They're still struggling with heating and air conditioning and whatnot.
I mean, it's probably not so different from today.
Yeah, I
really,
mean, and
they
it's a better time than today.
But yeah.
But yeah. I mean, there's less economic inequality in the time they're talking about than there is now.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these people are probably in unions. They'll probably be getting benefits from
But a lot of these themes that are being talked about could very well apply.
Yes. But their perspective is still one of great dissatisfaction, especially in Britain, because you have this aristocratic layer, which is not the richest layer necessarily, because of business people and whatnot by that point. But at the same time, you have this still unfair distinction in society that is causing dissatisfaction, and then once again, all these cultural complexes in the mainstream, both of the US and Britain, of like family values and stuff. And it was less strong in Britain than it was here. But the social caring about other people's values were stronger in Britain than they were here. Both of those all still part of the same complex of ideas, though. It's a synthesis of social conservatism and social democracy. Even though the social democracy advocates generally were not socially conservative, and socially conservative people were generally skeptical of the social democracy element, the voters and the culture kind of absorbed the synthesis of them. And there's kind of a posturing of how we are different from the communists, right? And that is in some ways the religious part, even though Britain was less religious, over strictness in society and the rigidness and the kind of a Tory Winston Churchill continuation. That is not horrific, it's not without caring, but it is still rigid. And that applies to conservatism in the 50s of the United States, so to some extent more immediately worse within the country, but arguably worse altogether in Britain in the sense of they had a bunch of colonies. But, thus you kind of have this weird situation where the working class is better off than they would be normally. There was a more social cohesion, but it's also limiting in some ways, and the situation is still unfair. And that's kind of the dual lashing out. And in some ways, it's the contradiction. There's kind of an individualist lashing out on the worst part of that system. For a white guy. For kind of the social control element. But also still, in the class and stuff, lashing out also at the rich. But none of that really came to any fruit. And a place where something kind of like that kind of did happen, and did come to bear fruit, was in China. Which, despite being under the control of communists,
I think
had a second revolution.
I can see it. I can see it now, Ben. I can see the clickbait YouTube thumbnail coming now. what the Who has to do with Confucianism and China, and
But I think this is a direct connection. I'm willing to assert that I think that Townsend and stuff probably did have this in mind. Because there was a spread in the more alienated parts of the counterculture in the 60s, often very sincerely, often well-intentioned. Some of the people that advocated this were quite good, heroes like Fred Hampton, of Maoist ideas as a solution of like a cultural revolution and of like a broad popular front and stuff as the solution to the both of these problems, as to the social problem of control, obviously being worse for African Americans or Afro-British people or colonial subjects or women or whatever. Tons of groups like that, and also as a solution to the economic issue. But as the situation in China's Cultural Revolution was basically just Mao and a clique of people manipulating people into not getting rid of threats for him in a very unorganized, in some ways very chaotic, some ways quite organized, but in many ways very chaotic, seemingly seemed to many people to be spontaneous, but also very highly manipulated outburst of violence and just out of controlness. When people came to realize what out of control situation that was, and this thing was going on past, to some degree, the winding down, all the way up until Mao's death.
I mean, we've seen a lot of instances
after
of...
White House and stuff. There's a great deal of alienation with both the filials of 68 to produce much progress. In France, it produced some gains for labor unions, but not any political progress. So instead of
you saw a lot of stuff like this.
But basically nothing.
Like, for instance, you've seen a lot of anti-Vietnam songs in America. This is America, not China. You see, like in Southern Man, they say basically that revolution, but it'll get down to it. Soldiers are cutting us down. Should have been done long ago. They basically promised that revolution's basically imminent, and just none ever came.
Yeah. So in songs like "Won't Be Fooled Again" and stuff, but also arguably in some of Be Shelter and to some degree, and just other works that reflect on the end of the 60s, there's a sense of number one that it failed. Even though arguably it did get us out of the war, resulted in massive cultural changes. Actually, a cultural revolution, not in the sense of Mao's, but not in a weird way, violent, chaotic thing being manipulated by this one dude, but a genuine cultural sea change. But then at the same time, that it was not producing political results, that it was not producing economic changes. It was just kind of washing around, and that in the place where it did happen. In the place that it did happen, it actually made things worse.
Yeah, well, it never really... No hippie ideal ever really came about. And honestly, I'm not so sure that that the world would have been better if it had. I'm not personally a fan of, some of all this stuff that they believe. I mean, you can't just fix the world. They'll say, we're going to do a revolution, and, we're going to make the world better. Maybe we'll abolish the government. Maybe we'll be able to sit around and do drugs and have, sex all day with whoever we like. The thing is, sitting around all day, taking LSD, and having sex, it's not a revolution, because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change who's in power. It doesn't do anything. It's not really exactly an action so much as it is an inaction.
Well, and to some extent,
it was a lot of talk. It was, we're going to go out and we're going to do this revolution, Just you wait. I'll go tomorrow. We'll go out and we'll do a revolution. But give me a time to take another, LSD. Give me time to, whatever. And they just never did, because they never really could. So it's always, I could do it. Just watch me. But just give me one more second. Just one more thing first, And
I don't know. I'm actually going to disagree on this. I think the issue here is that, in some extent, a lot of hippies didn't believe in the actual revolution part. Oh, not in a violent revolution, definitely, or really not even a political thing.
Well,
They were just extreme individualists.
Some of them
which
just
is
treat
a form
it
of
as some of them just treat it as an aesthetic or an excuse
Yeah.
to go and laze around and take a bunch of drugs and
political action in and of itself, because it was combating the prevalent ideology related to these things. But at the same time, it's not a revolutionary ideology, not even a reformist ideology. It's a very hyper-individualistic ideology in hippiedom. The new left, connected to it, the other component of the political counterculture, is the ones that were taking inspiration from Mao, or other people, or from Trotsky, or there's different variations, or from themselves. There's like 10 different billion variations of it. Ultimately, I would say that the new left, more extreme components, did attempt to take action. There was an attempt at a general strike and almost succeeded in France. That was not like a weird communist cell wave taking over, but just widespread protest that had support from some mainstream politicians, like former Prime Minister Pierre Mendès, future President Mitterrand, whatever. A kind of revolutionary wave that really did start to take off, but it did not give as much institutional support as it would have needed from, for instance, the Soviets or other people that need to take off. Arguably, also the Prague Spring in the Eastern Bloc against the Soviets for democratic socialism, a more individualistic socialism, is also part of that. The Black Panther Party is a part of that. There's also the development of these real terror cells, the years of lead in Italy and stuff. It's all a part of that. So there is action here. But there's also alienation from its failure, and then in the place it did succeed, it being the Chinese Revolution succeeding, I guess, but like being a horrific mess. And also then on the hippies' part, the hippies' ideas of we don't need a revolution, we could just build a free your mind instead. Also not really solving anything. But here's my counterpart to you. The hippies' free your mind instead ideology, though it failed to get what the hippies wanted, succeeded. It succeeded in promoting individualism in society, and it morphed. And it morphed into neoliberalism, unfortunately.
Okay.
Neoliberal ideologies. But yes, no, we've gone off track now.
Excuse me, I want to, just because I know we went off kind of from the Who and onto kind of a more political topic, I want to ask Matthew, what are your thoughts, I guess, on everything me and Ben just said? Because even though you're, I guess, less versed in Who's discography, I do think you could probably comment on some of these kind of greater, more broad, overarching statements.
That's more of Ben's territory, I think.
Okay, that's fair. So, I guess something we need to do now is we need to discuss what is the best free album run The Who had.
I guess I'll start.
Yeah, because Matthew's not going to do it. So it's just me and you, and I'll let you do it first.
I'm gonna... Okay, so we included live and leads in the previous thing.
See, here's the thing. This is what makes it, really iffy. We can include live at leads in the previous thing, but we can also cut it out for free consecutive
Yes, I'm cutting out this. I'm cutting out live at leads here. Not because I think that that's a bad album, but it undermines what I'm gonna say. It's Tommy Who's Next Quadrophenia.
Yeah.
I mean, two of those are pretty clear concept rock albums.
Agreed. I agree.
Who's Next is less so, but has this rock opera elements from Lifehouse in it.
I mean, but
it also has like the 3 best Who songs on it. I don't know.
You've got parts that clearly go together quite similarly, that feel kind of like divorced, but like that they were part of the same thing. Like the parts about Out Here in the Fields, I Fought for My Mills and stuff on Barbara Wiley feel like they fit with part where later on where it's like I sing my song to wide open places and whatever, and this song is over and all that stuff. Like it feels like some of those, not necessarily even the whole songs, but like specific parts of the songs could have gone together at some point or another.
I mean,
Behind Blue Eyes obviously feels like a character song from like a musical to some degree. Won't Get Fooled Again it could be kind of a finale, kind of an epilogue to something, or it could just be a song about, revolution and how, it could replace, good governments with worse ones, or just bad governments with other bad ones. It's obviously something we've seen quite a bit. I think that's really what it's about, and it's honestly the best song by The Who because, first of all, it's long, but it's a good length, it's not too short, and, then you have it and Barbara Wiley and Behind Blue Eyes all on the same album, and then you have other stuff, you have Borgen, you have My Wife, you have This Song Is Over, you have, some other stuff, it's really just a great album.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it is still Lifehouse. I mean, other than My Wife, all the songs from it all from Lifehouse. It's more like, instead of a complete Lifehouse, it's like a fragmented version of Lifehouse reassembled.
Yeah,
it's like,
if it had, honestly, like, Long Live Rock on there in the place of My Wife, it probably would,
yeah, just be another short version of Lifehouse,
It would be kind of an incoherent version of Lifehouse, but it would kind of be.
I mean, it wouldn't be the rock opera Lifehouse. It'd be the concept album Lifehouse. And then it is a concept album still. It's still a concept album with the themes of Lifehouse.
It feels like a very broad sort of cinematic album, but at the same time, it has no intelligible plot whatsoever. It's kind of like it's a vibe in and of itself. I don't want to say it's like the hard rock version of like Fantasia or something, but it has it has a style to it that kind of implies kind of broad overarching things. You see these fields, but then you also see this kind of revolution, and you see all this stuff, and you see these characters, but then there's not, actually any real kind of really substantive connections between them that aren't quite, formed yet.
I'm not sure if they were formed, and then they will break it apart, but in some ways I think there is still I'm not going to go as far as to call this a rock album because of the way it was broken apart, reassembled. But it is, in some ways, does have a plot still. Albeit one that has been not like as coherent as Tommy's or like Quadrophenia's. But in it, you do still have this like revolutionary energy and of like individuals setting off. It's not the same plot as Lifehouse, to be sure, exactly, but you have this energy of individuals out in the fields fighting for their meals, this revolutionary energy and that, and going mobile and all that. Now, Behind Blue Eyes is like the real counterpoint because that's the villain song.
Like,
but
what you have is, as I said earlier, Tommy is a album essentially about the individual Tommy being an individual who's pushed around from society, but eventually he goes from being the individual to trying to make everyone like him, and so there's no individualism into him anymore if he tries to turn everyone into him by making them, put on their earplugs, put on their eye shades, and try to play pinball just like he does and whatever at the end. And so it becomes the people against him who saying we're not going to take it, who sort of become the individuals fighting against what becomes almost the establishment in Tommy himself. So Tommy goes from being the underdog, the little guy, and then he becomes sort of the establishment and is trying to make people like him, and then these other people will then the underdog, the little guy, and eventually, I guess, to some degree, maybe they'll raise up to become like Tommy, and then someone else will overthrow them, and kind of in the theme of won't get fooled again, and then who's next has kind of a theme of individualism as well. Barbara Wiley clearly has it, but clearly has it from a somewhat older perspective, a little wiser perspective than what you would see with like Jimmy on Quadrophenia, which is obviously an album about individualism as well. Behind Blue Eyes is about a guy who's generally seen as a bad guy. It's about his, personal personality. This is me. I'm not like you necessarily. I'm what I am. And Don't Get Fooled Again is kind of a statement of that too. It's basically, the people rose up together. They tried to overthrow the old boss, they got the new boss. It's not really different. Nothing in the street looks any different, because ultimately that's, I guess, not where the change comes from. Is the violent act, I guess, of overthrowing to some degree. It comes from something else. Individual change, maybe. I don't know if that's really what they're going for. And then, obviously, you got other songs like, this song's overall, obviously, as I said, it has thought about, I sing the song. Borgen is honestly kind of a song about a guy who is kind of a mess, but he's engaged in this romance, and he kind of wants his wife, girlfriend, significant other, whatever, to see him for what he is, but to still, I guess, love him for that. My Wife is, to some degree, a song of a guy, sort of, I guess, declaring his independent support from his relationship. Going Mobile is obviously a song of a guy with his car, who loves his car, trying to declare his sort of individuality through the means of an automobile and being able to move around and having free movement. And also the Watch the Police if a taxman miss me is obviously a kind of a statement on the government as well. So it has, Who's Next has very similar themes, if you look at it like that, to Tommy, which is ultimately a album about an individual who's the underdog of society, who then goes to being the big guy who's pushing around the underdog and gets overthrown. And then, so that's something that kind of explores the dynamic between individuality, authoritarianism, and revolution, sort of. I mean, we aren't going to take it as kind of a revolution kind of against Tommy within the concept. No revolution really happens in Quadrophenia. It's more of the, this is kind of more of like what happened in real life. The revolution, they tried to sort their individuality. The revolution never really exactly came.
I wouldn't say Jimmy is actually assaulting his individuality, but continue.
The Face, he was, is this big shot guy. He ends up basically running at Rich People's Hill as a bellboy. At the end, Tommy, he tries to sort his individuality by kind of joining in what's kind of countercultural, but it never really quite works because, his parents don't approve. In the movie you get even, obviously, some different stuff. He never really quite gets along with some other members of that culture, but it's not as exactly apparent in the album. But it's very much a statement of him at least trying to explore his identity and his individuality, I believe, through also kind of interacting with this movement, even though the movement is in and of itself a movement, which would imply a sort of broad, non-individualistic sort of thing. It never quite works for him. He gets, high, he gets drunk, he gets a little weird, and I guess ultimately in the end he comes to the conclusion that I guess doing that's not really what he needs to do. Really what he needs is love, I guess, from Love Rain on Me. I'm gonna be honest.
All you need is love.
I'm gonna be honest, Quadrophenia's ending, this is kind of a bit vague. It's a bit clear in the movie, but it's essentially just, honestly, it's just saying that, you try to do this stuff, join this culture, you think it's gonna be revolutionary, it comes and goes, the times change, some people fell at it, some people end up with a decently alright lot in life, but it's still nothing really truly revolutionary. It kind of, I guess, stands as kind of the ending one. Tommy ends with a revolution, sort of, although it's a revolution against Tommy. Who's Next ends basically with Won't Get Fooled Again, which is basically saying, okay, we've done a revolution, but it wasn't any good, and we won't get fooled again and try it again, because it really didn't help matters. And then Quadrophenia ends with basically them not really being a revolution. It's just basically Jimmy does whatever he does, and it was never really about revolution because revolution really wasn't going to do anything for him. He wasn't going to become a more stable person if there had been a revolution. He wasn't going to get love if there was a revolution. Nothing really about Jimmy himself is going to be fixed by a revolution. It's ultimately about him. It's not about changing society, really. And so the whole statement of sort of the interaction between individuality and revolution.
Yeah, what was I'm gonna say is, I don't know how I exactly agree with your readings on some of those things. I mostly do, but not entirely. With Tommy, for instance, Tommy tries to convert his individuality into a collective action, and fails. But I would argue that Townsend's sympathy is pretty clearly with Tommy and not the other people.
Well, and in behind Blue Eyes, Townsend's sympathy is with the narrator.
Yeah, but he's primarily sympathetic, or at least systemically sympathetic, in Who's Next, and in Lifehouse, with the people revolt.
I don't think he thinks Tommy's a saint, but I don't think he thinks...
Well, he doesn't think Tommy's a saint,
no. He thinks Tommy's an individual who makes questionable decisions.
I don't think
it's a dig that what happens at the end of Tommy is this a dig at Tommy, but I don't think saying that it's not something saying Tommy's a bad person is it the same thing as saying that it's also not saying that what Tommy did wasn't, to some degree wrong or stupid. And even though, and won't get fooled again, they say that the revolution didn't help matters, I don't think that's necessarily a thing saying that revolution can't exactly always help things in some degree, but it's not a replacement for, sometimes people try to do these revolutions, they go out, they tear shit up, they do these things, and sometimes they're not actually tackling the problem head on. They're either not tackling their personal problems, or there's a better way to tackle their societal problems.
Or the structural problems.
Or to do something else other than actually a violent revolution. It's about putting a revolution in the wrong context. That's what the people did. But he's not necessarily saying they're wrong exactly for doing so. Clearly the sympathy's on them because they've been fooled and they won't get fooled again, although presumably they actually will get fooled again. So the sympathy is on the people who did the revolution, only to see it just really not do anything.
I mean, that's because the issue was not the guy in Behind Blue Eyes, who is the villain, but he's not the biggest issue. He's just a sept of it. They're just replacing him with somebody else. But and he's not this pure evil man of blood.
That's the same thing with Tommy. Tommy goes from being kind of the little guy who's being bullied to then trying to push his own personality on everyone else. But the sympathy is with him. He's a symptom to some degree of what happened to him. It's a cycle to some degree, but it's what happened to him. He ends up kind of becoming that to some degree, and then getting overthrown again, and then possibly those people will, who knows what they'll do, but the people who, from We're Not Gonna Take It, who, escaped Tommy's cult, or woke up Tommy's cult, or whatever, maybe they're gonna become sort of the very thing that they didn't like Tommy doing. The whole point is, Tommy, what happened to him is a symptom, too, of how his type of people were being treated to begin with.
Yes,
and it caused them to sort of become the thing they didn't like, or it caused Tommy to become sort of the authoritarian figure when he was previously being victimized by all these people, and that obviously screwed him up, and obviously the sympathy is on him.
Yeah. I think you're not wrong in some ways, but at the same time, and I agree, Townsend portrays Tommy as overextending. He tries to make people... He doesn't know really how to communicate what happened to him, so he tries to do pinball. and like pretend to be him and whatever. That is overextending and unacceptable.
But Tommy is an
But-
epic gamer dude. He just like me
Yes,
for
well.
real.
No, what I was gonna say, I don't think the moral of the story of Tommy and the moral of the story of Who's Next are parallel. I just don't think that they are. Because Townsend does not disagree with most of the things that he has Tommy say to these people that get them upset. Townsend has repeatedly expressed that he thinks that people shouldn't be getting drunk or smoking weed or whatever, but that's not the path of alignment. He clearly assigns ideas that belong to Mel Barber to Tommy, and then feel mad at him for saying those things that are true because they want a quick way out. So his sympathy is clearly maybe not 100% not with the people
But that defeats the
going against Tommy. His sympathy is very clearly with Tommy.
Ben, that defeats the individualistic theme. See, the thing is, I think to some degree, they can't reach that conclusion by following a cult like Tommy's. They can't reach it by doing a revolution like Won't Get Fools Again's revolution. I think what the meaning is you can't force people to do this because they'll revolt against it. They have to, to some degree, come across it on their own by doing stuff, you know. Ultimately, I think Jimmy comes to the conclusion that, as I said, that ultimately being Dr. Jimmy, you know, to his Mr. Jim, with the pills and the alcohol isn't really what's best. What he really needs is love or whatever. And so ultimately, to some degree, it's a story about that too, I guess you could say, about, you know, like, abuse and whatever, because I think ultimately he's saying you can't force people not to do it. You know, you can help people, whatever. You can't force them not to do it by ordering them.
Oh, I'll agree that he thinks that.
They can't fix their own problems by doing a revolution or by you helping them do a revolution or anything like that. They have to individually go and, to some degree, fix themselves and come to this conclusion on their own. And I think Quadrophenia kind of sells that at the end.
I mean, with Quadrophenia, I'll agree that Jimmy rebels against one thing, one conformist society, by getting into noble. But, and I'll agree with those parallels between all three. All three involve people rebelling in some ways. And they all have a lot of shared themes. But I don't think Townsend is attempting to spew in... Definitely not in Tommy, and I don't really think in any of these. And they're all about alienated individuals. I don't think Townsend believes in a hyper-individualism. I don't think any of his... Tommy is in many ways a reaction to that. It's not in favor of it. The hippie characters in it are in the wrong. They say that they're going to rape Tommy. I don't think they actually do, but they threaten to.
Well, you know, they're not the good guys either. I mean, they're doing bad stuff once again. The problem is, none of these people, because to some degree, Tommy, to some degree, wants to have his way with them. Right. They, to some degree, want to have their way with him.
They also want to have their way with themselves.
And they also want to have their way with themselves. To some degree, it's more or less a cautionary tale against excessive hyper-individuality, but also collectivism. Tommy becomes so wrapped up in his own individuality that he tries to make the world basically what his individual is. Whereas in some of these other cases, like Won't Get Fooled Again, they're led on by the men who spurred them on to some degree, and they're following that to some degree, believing that will fix whatever personal problems they're having, and that's overly collectivist. And to some degree, what happens with Jimmy is that as well. He goes and he joins this kind of countercultural, but that's kind of a collective in and of itself, and he ultimately finds that it ultimately goes nowhere. The face becomes a bellboy, and, none of his problems are fixed. And ultimately, he honestly comes to what is more or less of a culturally conservative conclusion that, yeah, oh, he needs love or whatever. It's kind of a more kind of antiquated, kind of more 1950s sounding kind of domestic ideal in the end, to some degree, that he arrives at.
I mean, I don't know if... I don't think Jimmy gets domesticated at all. In some ways, he's more alienated.
Not really.
I don't think he wins,
he never really actually
has a war happen to him.
He never actually ends up with anyone.
The revolution isn't wrong or wrong impulse. Evolution is not a wrong impulse in who's next. It's just, it's not acting in a systemic way. It's just replacing the old boss with the new boss. And in Tommy, yes, Tommy overextends and is trying to be too controlling. But at the same time, yes, like you said, the hyper-individualism, the we want to... The hippies, I mean, the people that join his camp want a quick fix to salvation. The hyper-individualistic, and Townsend, I think, thoroughly bashes them for them, but they're worse to Tommy. Tommy did bad. But Tommy is still the sympathetic character. He's not a sympathetic villain. He is... I mean, he did kind of... I mean, it's a combination of the guru model of sorts, but also... It is also a combination of this idea that collectivist... against collectivist action, against doing whole things, or, like, against that. I mean... I think in Who's Next, everyone is alienated up until the point that they do collective action, and that the revolution won't get fooled again, is good in that sense. But in the sense of that then the individual, said they put in power, as individuals, and of their own individual desire for power, of authoritarian desire for power, then alienate that again. It's not a selfish hippie ideology. It is counter to that. Quadrophenia is more complicated because a lot of it has to do with Jimmy's mental health issues and whatnot, but I mean, yes, there's a great sense of that none of these things are resolving the issue, and they're so condemned in a sense, but like, clearly individual selfishness, or like hyper-individualism, I would say is the most condemned, not collectivist action. Or it's not, you better free your mind instead. Tommy frees his mind and makes the situation worse, even if he's correct, and he is on many of the things he says, from Townsend's point of view.
Yes, well, it's my understanding that the ending of Quadrophenia is basically Jimmy decides that he can't exactly solve his... Well, he becomes disillusioned with the counterculture, Bellboy, and then he comes to the conclusion, more or less, that he can't solve his problems with drugs or alcohol like he was trying to do in Dr. Jimmy, and in the end, he decides that the conclusion is only love can bring the rain, but then he doesn't actually know how to go about getting that.
Yeah.
So it kind of ends on a kind of a hanging note. He comes to this conclusion that ultimately reinforces more of a standard cultural belief than the countercultural belief that he was kind of holding of going around doing all this crazy stuff. But at the same time, he doesn't know how to actually do it. There's no really clear road forward for him.
So love is not necessarily not something that's not in the counterculture. Obviously, it's very prevalent in its writings and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, once again, I think that the response is Jimmy's hyper... I would say that is, once again, not a hyper-individualistic ending. That Jimmy... Love is a multiple individual thing.
Yes, it comes
and it's not
back
like
around
love, like...
It comes back around, I think, to
Jimmy's
some degree,
selfishness is selfless.
It comes back around to some degree of, you're right, selflessness, kind of similar to, like, as we were talking about the kids all white earlier. It comes back to sort of a a collective thing, kind of like a family, but a smaller, not on the same level as like Tommy's cult. Not as big or as like self-involved as that or anything. It's just you know, you talk about the nuclear family, you talk about, you know, whatever. I don't know what exactly the model in it, you know, is for Jimmy, but it comes back around to, you know, Tommy says you can't do it all as a huge collective, you know, and Who's Next kind of says that as well. But Quadrophenia says you can't do it as just an individual. You've got to have some sort of collective, but it doesn't need to be too big or too self-involved.
I think it's against hierarchical models of a collective, at least.
Yes.
It rejects the traditional hierarchical 50 society that was being pushed, which did try to take care of, I guess, white men and whatnot, and had some value structures, and some of which were good and some of which were bad, but was a very controlling society, and it rejects that as being bad. It's restricting the individual's right to be themselves. It is controlling people and producing, but also rejects the most common reaction to that, which is hyper-hippie individualism. That is also not solving that. That's just leading to even more alienation. Quick fixes of, you know, trying to use weed for salvation and being, whatever, which Tansen thought was bad.
To some degree, it's saying it's advocating a middle ground between, you know, being in a group and being an individual. Being a group that's, you know, relatively small, and it's a relatively, you know, caring, benevolent sort of thing where you don't lose sight of the individual, but you also don't lose sight of anyone else other than yourself, like Tommy did. And it is, that's ultimately what it is, I think. It's it's an advocation for sort of, and it's an advocation against these quick fixes, and it's to show some sort of, I guess, prudence in where you're going, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, there was a lot of historical precedent to people that reject both hierarchical collectivism or hierarchical communitarian understandings, control that are anti-authoritarian, but are also against hyper-individualism or selfishness or like that stuff. It's a rejection of both, and I agree. Both of those things probably should be rejected. Only caring about yourself is bad. Having societal structures that control you and strip you of your individuality, also bad. So I think we're in alignment there.
And it's about recognizing each person's individual talents to some degree. You know, if you're the pinball wizard, you should be recognized as such.
Yeah, but then at the same time, there's also a sense that you can't just think only about yourself either. Has to be some level of not hippie selfishness, but more broad caring.
Yeah, like Tommy's not noticing, like Tommy's not noticing Sally getting hurt and whatever.
Yes, that's actually a great example. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's kind of a rejection of both the bad elements of the counterculture and the bad elements of culture, and the destructive elements of both of them. I agree. I think we should try to wrap things up for now and come back
tomorrow. Like, you need to listen, Matthew, to Tommy and to Quadrophenia, because otherwise, I'm sure you may have dozed off or something, but I'm sure you're at a loss as to what me and Pim were just talking about.
I will listen to those albums.
Good.
So yes, the albums we were discussing were Tommy, Who's Next, and Quadrophenia. Christopher and I agreed that those were the three best two album ones.
And Matthew, had already listened to Who's Next. But yeah, I think me and Ben both agree that Tommy, Who's Next, and Quadrophenia is the best free album one by The Who. Alright, here at the end of this video, I want to once again thank everybody for watching this video on The Who. Obviously, we got into kind of a long-winded debate there as to the meanings of Tommy and Quadrophenia, so it did go on quite a long time. We will have more podcast episodes of this, of the Rock Roundtable, coming up soon, including one next Wednesday. So I hope you all will stay tuned for that. And I want to once again thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.